that sort of distinction, knowing that something is the case. So in this sense, right, we still have a lot to discuss of what knowledge is. So we want to talk about the nature of knowledge. This has been something that's taken up philosophical debate since the very origins of the tradition, and probably even before that, right? What does it actually mean to know something? How is that different from, say, just believing it to be true? So, for example, if I were to, look at someone and say, I believe this person has 75 cents in their pocket, right? What's the difference between me just believing that that's the case and me actually knowing that that's the case? And so throughout the history of philosophy, we've arrived at a somewhat widely accepted definition up until the 1960s. So this was the prevailing understanding of what knowledge was up until just a few decades ago. So justified true belief is the idea that to know something, you have to meet three conditions. You have to believe it, belief in this case being a propositional attitude, right? So if we have the proposition, you have 75 cents in your pocket, right? I would take an attitude towards that as being either true or false, right? And so my propositional attitude basically constitutes my belief. So you can't believe something unless you actually take a position on its being true or false. So that's the idea there. So you have to first believe it. Okay, so I say, yes, I believe you have 75 cents in your pocket. Well, believing it is not going to be sufficient for me to know it. There has to be something else. And the most obvious candidate seems to be that, well, that belief has to actually be true in the world, right? I can't say that I know you have 75 cents in your pocket if it turns out that you don't, in fact, have 75 cents in your pocket. Whereas it does make sense for me to say, well, I believed it, but it turns out I was wrong. Okay, so we have to first believe a proposition, then it actually has to be true in the world, right? And so here we're taking a sort of objective understanding of truth, right? Something that could theoretically be verified, although that doesn't rule out the idea that, maybe it's true and you just don't know it. And that brings up lots of fun issues in epistemology, like, yeah, but do you know that you're right, like in that Friends episode. So we can always, talk about knowing that we know something. That's some upper level stuff. But here we're just saying, okay, it has to be something you believe and it has to actually be true in the world. But that in and of itself doesn't seem to be enough, right? Lots of people believe things that just turn out to be true, but we might say that the fact that they were true is not so much because they knew it, but maybe they were lucky, right? So let's say, okay, I think you have 75 cents in your pocket, and you say, well, why do you think that? And I say, well, because I had a dream that I would see someone today who had 75 cents in their pocket. You might think, well, I actually do have 75 cents in my pocket, but I don't think you really knew that. I think you more had a lucky guess, right? And so this introduces the third criteria, which is justification. It's not just enough to believe something and for that belief to be true. You have to have not just reasons for thinking that it was true, but good reasons, right? So in this case, when I'm talking about knowing an empirical proposition, well, having a dream about it might not seem like a good enough reason for it to be knowledge. Okay, so this brings up, again, a sort of broad definition that has been used throughout most of human history. But that was up until the 1960s, like I said, when a very famous philosopher who was made famous by a 2-page paper, so if you think you have to be able to write a lot to do important work, he's the counterexample. 2-page paper that totally undercut this definition of philosophy that had been used for thousands of years. And the basic idea comes from Edmund Gettier, and it's known as, of course, the Gettier problem. And the idea here is that this in and of itself doesn't seem to be enough because there are lots of things that would count as a justified true belief that wouldn't count as knowledge. So, for example, there are some issues with implication and logic, right? So if you have, one belief, the idea is that based on what that belief is composed of, it's going to imply or entail that you have other beliefs as well. So, for example, if you are going to work and you see that your coworker drives, a blue Chevy, and then that would imply, right, that you also believe that your coworker drives a blue Chevy, right? Because that person is your coworker, right? So the idea is that our beliefs come in webs, right? They imply a lot of other things. And so the problem is that we might be justified in believing one proposition, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're justified in believing a proposition that it's entailed by it. And since that justification doesn't transfer, knowledge wouldn't transfer either. And so there has to be something else besides justification to count as this. So the idea is, let's say you go to work one day and you have, one coworker, Susie, she drives a blue Chevy. But you arrive at work one day and you see that there's actually a red, Honda in the parking lot. Okay, well, now you think that Susie, sorry, I forgot what I gave her made-up name. You think that Susie bought a new car, that Susie bought a red Honda. Well, it turns out that you're wrong. Susie didn't buy a red Honda, but one of your other coworkers, Tommy, bought a red Honda. But the problem is, with the traditional notion of justified true belief, that would say that you knew that Tommy bought a new car because you knew that your coworker bought a new car. So the idea is, okay, Susie and Tommy are both your coworkers. So if Susie bought a new car, then you also believed that your coworker bought a new car, right? But Timmy also counts as one of your coworkers. So that makes it seem like you knew that Timmy had bought a new car, which you obviously didn't, right? Because you got the coworker incorrect. So this is just one example of how the notion of justified true belief is maybe not sufficient to give us an account of what knowledge is. And so in response to that, epistemology today is really a big response to this problem. Like, what can we add to this criteria to make sure that we're capturing knowing something rather than just believing it? And you might think, well, why is that so important? Well, knowledge holds a special status for us in life, right? Knowing something is a sign of your being an expert or an authority figure on that matter, right? And so carries a lot of weight, not just in, how we live our everyday lives, but also in who we're going to listen to gain new beliefs and new knowledge, right? And so in addition to talking about what knowledge is, another big area of epistemology is discussing the scope of knowledge, right? Exactly how much can we know, right? Is it possible in theory to know everything? Or are there potentially things that, even if they were true, we might never be able to know them, right? So maybe you think, well, yeah, there could be alien life out there in the world. I just don't think that, with the human capacity for knowledge, we'll ever be able to come to know that, right? In theory, we could if the evidence presented itself, right? Or humans were able to advance to a certain degree, but I just maybe don't think that's possible, and so we'll never know. You could also take this position on the existence of God, right? You could be agnostic and just say, well, it's not that I just don't know whether or not God exists yet. I don't think that's ever something a human being could know, right?